Good morning, everyone. While we get started, I'll just give a bit of an introduction to myself. My name's Janet Connochie. I'm a Senior Hazardous Substances Consultant with Chem Safety, and I've been with Chem Safety coming up to 22 years now. So in that time, I've been with the hazardous substances or the HAZMA regulations since their inception, and there's been a lot of change and a lot of interesting things have happened in that time. In today's session, we're going to be having a look at a range of topics that have caught my interest over the last couple of months. So we'll group it into about 4 themes. Sort of how's it going, what the PCBU duties are, what you should be doing. We'll be looking at some matters that WorkSafe have raised, and we'll have a look at some of those things that always seem to get away on us, the things that need renewing and updating. It's a continuous process. And then we'll have a look at some things where it was okay last time and why are we or your certifier telling you that it's not okay anymore, that things that have been accepted in the past may need improving. So we chat about the role of the PCBU and the role of the compliance certifier. As compliance certifiers, it's our job to verify that you as the PCBU have everything in place. The duties and responsibilities for the compliance lie with the PCBU. In the ideal world, we would come to site and be presented with all the evidence we need to confirm that the site is in compliance. You may not be surprised, however, to hear that this is not always the case. We can typically see about 3 states where the PCBU sits, and this is probably about as far as I can push this Omnibus down the track. But where the PCBU is sitting, it may be in the driver's seat. You know exactly what needs doing, you get it done, it's a breeze coming to do the certification, you know in advance what needs doing. You might be along for the ride. You're not sure of everything that you need to do, but once you're told about it, once you're given a wee push or a reminder, you get it done. And then there's people who might be struggling to get up. You don't have a good handle on things. Hazardous substances aren't your core focus of your business, so you need a bit of help. And in those situations, you need to make sure that you're getting the support and the assistance that you need to understand what's needed. And there's so much that people need to know when they are running a business or managing part of an operation, but it's really important to make sure that you do understand your responsibilities under the hazardous substances regulations. Taking a step back, we can have a look at the Act and the primary duty of care. So it's really easy to get caught up in the certification regime when you're managing your hazardous substance regulations. Someone's coming along each year and saying, I need to see X, Y, and Z, and you do those. But that's only a subset of the regulations. And the regulations absolutely cannot cover every situation that you're looking at. So your primary duty of care as a PCBU under the Health and Safety at Work Act is to ensure, so far as is reasonably practicable, the health and safety of workers. And to support that, there are regulations. There's the hazardous substance regulations, there's the general risk and workplace management regulations, and a whole suite of other ones that focus on other aspects of health and safety. The overarching principle of this is about identifying, eliminating, or managing the risks. And you would think that the hazardous substance regulations that are really thick, there's a lot of information in there, is very comprehensive and quite prescriptive. But we do still need to look at that higher principle of risk management. The regulations do tend to look or skew a bit towards the storage side, but within our hazardous substance regs is this one here about managing the risks associated with your hazardous substances. So it's not just a matter of following the prescriptive details. You need to be aware of the risks that are associated with your hazardous substances and that you're controlling them. And following the regulations will get you most of the way there, but there is more to be thought about. And it also shows that the regulations are a minimum standard. And if there are practical ways, following all practical steps, to reduce that risk, you should do so. When we're looking at the regulations or the information available to us to help manage these risks, we can break that down into two parts. So we've got the regulatory requirements, the regulations, the EPA notices, and there are other documents that fall under those, and it's very clear from their style. They've got a very familiar look to them. They're not the most attractive documents to look at and read, but they're very factual, and they will state clearly under them that they have been issued under particular acts or regulations. So our performance standards for compliance certification, these are things that compliance certifiers must follow. And that's one of the things that perhaps drives things that were okay in the past, and now we're looking at them more closely. And the safe work instruments, again, they have a regulatory standing to provide ways or changes to the regulations. Supporting the regulatory documents is guidance. And over the last 20 years or so, or in particular since the changes to the HAZWA Act, WorkSafe has published a range of documents, and they've got a whole lot of different titles. They've got special guides and practical guides and technical bulletins, policy clarifications. There's a lot of resource available there. There can sometimes be an attitude that these are only guidance. Anyone who's looked at the regulations in any detail will appreciate the amount of work that needs to go into producing these additional resources, guides, interpretations, and clarifications. So along with the standards, the Australian and New Zealand standards or other standards that might either be specified in the regulations, and so they have regulatory standing, or exist as industry practice, the guidance and standards provide a level of reassurance that you're taking all additional practical steps that you need to manage your risk. And should something go pear-shaped, and there is published relevant guidance around the topic or the incident that's happened, you might be asked pointed questions about why you didn't consult, consider, or implement guidance information that's out there. And there may very well be good reasons for that, but it should be made as a considered decision, and not just be, it's not in the regulations, I don't have to. And the workplace exposure standards are a great example of that. When it comes to controlling workplace exposure, you need to make sure that we're controlling the risks, reducing it as far as practical, and then we've got the guideline values in the workplace exposure standard to provide a bit of a benchmark so that we've got something to compare to. But with one exception, there's only one prescribed exposure standard that needs to be adhered to. The rest of them are guidance there, but it's really important guidance, because otherwise you've got nowhere to place yourself when you're looking at your exposure. So that's just a bit of a background, a bit of a thought that I've been having over the recent times about just where those responsibilities and the information lies. It's not our job as compliance certifiers to tell you what to do as such. It's something that you should know. We are here to help. So moving on to our next topic. In the last few months, there's a couple of issues that have popped up from WorkSafe, and WorkSafe gets information through from their audit regime, from complaints or queries from industry around particular issues. And the two issues I wanted to talk about in this session, which we've seen in the publicity for it, is around site plans and flammable liquids cabinets. We published 2 recent articles about these as well. So your site plans do not have to be full CAD drawings, but there are now several providers out there who specialise in preparing those and preparing plans for you. So I think I have lost one of my slides, which is terribly disappointing because it's a brilliant one that I did in Minecraft. There. Perfectly acceptable site plans can be prepared using basic Office Suite software. So when we're looking at our site plans, one of the main things we want to consider is what the purpose of it is. If someone has turned up at your site and needs to see your site plan, why are they asking for it? So It's to provide information, it's to provide clarity, it's to demonstrate that you understand what some of the compliance matters on your site are, and that to provide clear information to people. So if you need to come along, you've given me your site plan when I've turned up to do your inspection, and then you need to come along next to me and explain where different things on that are, what the site plan means, then it's not a clear document that's fit for purpose. It should be able to be used standalone to clearly indicate where things are. Who needs to see the site plans? So, site plans are useful for a multitude of purposes within your business, but they need to be presented to compliance certifiers. They might be presented to WorkSafe when they're doing an inspection. It might be used for FENS when they're responding to an emergency. So there are different audiences and different purposes, and so you shouldn't try and put all of that information onto a single piece of paper. The minimum information required for certification depends on which class you're looking at, but generally we need to make sure we've got a site boundary, and these days getting a GIS aerial image from the council websites is a really good way of getting that legal boundary and showing in an aerial context what it is that we're looking at. We need to show the hazardous substance locations, and it should show all of the hazardous substance locations on site, even if we're just there at that point in time to be looking at one of them for certification. When we talk about hazardous substance locations, there's two ways you can look at it. There's the technical legislative one, which is when you've exceeded the threshold, or you might use it in a more generic term as a place where there's hazardous substances. So regulations require that you identify the hazardous substance locations. We need to identify our separation distances and control zones, and I'll talk about those again just briefly. And we need to identify our hazardous areas, and if we've got toxic or corrosive substances, we need to identify on our site plan where all our protected places are, so that you've gone through that exercise of thinking in the context of your operation, what are the protected places? And it's generally where people work, and there's been policy clarification published by WorkSafe around that. Perhaps didn't go as far as we would have liked in giving examples, but it's a restating or an interpretation of the regulations there. In order to be useful, we need to make sure that we've got a clear scale and a north orientation so that we can clearly place the part of the site plan that we're looking at in front of us when we're looking at the site. If you've only got a basic site, then one page might be enough, but generally the information that we need, the number of locations that you have on site, the extent and scale of your site means that your site plan is actually going to be a set of documents and a set of drawings. Once you start adding more and more information, it can become quite confused. And so again, making sure that you've got clear plans for each purpose. So if we're looking at site plans like this one in the previous example, which has come from WorkSafe's guidance around service stations, there will be a plan that shows the stormwater information and the layout and the emergency equipment, and then this one that's showing the hazardous areas and separation distances. And so they're all clear on their page what you're looking at in that context. We also need to make sure that if we're not drawing an elevation and a plan of our hazardous area is a three-dimensional space, that we're putting the description on it so that we can see that. And if you're needing to get any electrical work done, for example, making sure that there's a clear designation of that hazardous area is very important. We had a question come through in advance of the webinar. Thank you for those who sent questions through. I've got a couple of them that I am covering today. So this question was, can we confirm if the exclusion or separation zone distance for the dangerous goods stores is measured from the external door openings or is also required to be measured from external wall vents? So the first thing I want to say here is that it's important to get our terminology right. We have different zones that we need to establish for our hazardous substances. So we've got our separation distance from protected or public places, and we've got controlled zones, which are similar. So for flammable, toxic, and corrosive substances, we're needing to make sure that our store is separated from protected or public places, but we don't necessarily need to prevent people from passing through that area. For controlled zones, which apply to classes 4 and 5, we also need to exclude unauthorised people. So the purpose of separation distances in controlled zones is that in the event of something going wrong, we've got a means of protecting the public and the protected facilities, the other people on site. So those requirements are about something's gone wrong. We want to make sure the harm, the risk doesn't spread or impact on other things. We also have hazardous areas. And these are areas where there is the potential for flammable gases or vapours to be present, and therefore we need to exclude ignition sources from those. These are determined for flammable gases and liquid in accordance with the Australian New Zealand standard, just rolls off the tongue, 6079.10.1. It's the classification of hazardous areas. Other classes of substances might require separation from ignition sources, but it's not necessarily a hazardous area. This applies to just flammable liquid gases and vapours. So in the event of in relation to the question, we need to establish whether we're talking about a separation distance or a hazardous area zone or a hazardous atmosphere zone, a hazardous area. If we're looking at a dangerous goods store, the separation distance is measured from the outside of the store if we're dealing with flammable liquids, or for toxic and corrosive substances, we might be measuring that distance from the store, from the designated area where we keep it, the edge of the bund that the substances are sitting in, or from the tank. And WorkSafe has published some guidance around where the distances are measured from those areas. So it's around the structure, not necessarily the vents. With hazardous areas, we are dealing with a vapour path. So looking at where if the vapour can go out the door, then it could also go out the vent. So we are needing to measure those hazardous areas around external wall vents or other openings, and there will be consideration needed to be given as to the nature of the gas or the vapour, whether it's heavier or lighter than air. Most of them are heavier than air. And then that also relates to maybe you need that hazardous area around the low-level vents, but not around the high-level vents. If there's an extraction system, then there'll be an area at the end of that extraction system as well. Unfortunately, whenever I get questions about the hazardous substance regulations, there's not usually a quick, short answer. Moving on to flammable liquids cabinets. Earlier this year, WorkSafe published a technical bulletin relating to flammable liquids cabinets, and the purpose of this was to raise awareness of the need to ensure that cabinets purchased are and continue to be operated in a compliant manner. There had been some concerns raised to WorkSafe that some cabinets didn't comply, and that we've seen as certifiers that people using cabinets don't maintain them in good condition. So this bulletin looks at both of those aspects. And some of the key checkpoints in there are around secondary containment. So the base of your cabinet is the secondary containment for it, and so you're not allowed to store things in there. There's a shelf that goes onto it. We often see people removing that lower shelf so they can put more containers in. It talks about the construction materials, that they do not melt or fail at the given temperature, and so that precludes some aluminium fittings and rivets and hinges and things from being used. If there's more than one door on the cabinet, well, they all need to be self-closing and latching. If there's more than one door, we need to make sure that they're closing in the right order, and that's something that can drift over time and require maintenance. The shelving in flammable liquids cabinets is required to allow circulation of air, and also the gap between the shelves and the walls can help with that circulation of air. If you are purchasing a flammable liquids cabinet, you'll need to, you would like to be able to accept that your supplier has compliantly constructed the cabinet and has marked it as compliant with the standard. It is a requirement of the standard that the cabinet has the name and address of the New Zealand manufacturer or distributor of that, and so that should also give you somewhere to go, that it's not just perhaps one of the American details on it. It should state that it complies with the particular standard, AS 1940. With the document that WorkSafe have published, there are a few issues in their clarification that various aspects of industry are debating at the moment as to whether they've gone perhaps a wee bit beyond the standard in their interpretation. But if you've got questions about that, talk to your cabinet supplier or your certifier about that. From a maintenance perspective, it's making sure that it's not corroding, that everything is working as it should be. There are other cabinets out there. So the majority that we see are for flammable liquids, and the focus from WorkSafe was on flammable liquids cabinets. Cabinets are available from other classes, and they do differ from each other. So it's really important to make sure that you've got the right cabinet for the right job. So for the different classes, they are cabinets constructed to the various standards, either Australian or Australian-New Zealand joint standards, generally speaking. And there are differences in construction. So, for example, some cabinets require that there are catches that automatically engage on the doors, and other cabinets require that the doors are able to release pressure in the event of a pressure buildup. And there are some other wee changes in between them. So you can't just go and buy a flammable liquids cabinet, change the diamond on the front and put your oxidizers in there. That's not what those are designed for. Whether or not cabinets are required for the storage of your hazardous substances, it sort of depends. So for Class 3 flammable liquids, cabinets to AS 1940 or to the European standard mentioned there, they are 1 hour fire rated cabinets, are an option. They're an available compliant location, which is needed if you're storing, for example, flammable liquids, highly flammable liquids, more than 15 litres, or containers greater than 5 litres. So that might not be where you need a location compliance certificate, could be below that threshold, but those quantities need to be stored in a compliant location, and a cabinet is one of those compliant locations. If you've got small quantities, cabinets are very useful for those. For Class 6 and 8 substances, your toxics and corrosives, they are a specified option in the regulations for storing toxics and corrosives at a hazardous substance location. So you've exceeded the threshold. In practice, there are storage limits for how much you can store in the cabinets, which are around about the same level as the hazardous substance threshold. So it's unlikely, but not impossible, that we would see a cabinet for compliance certification, but they are always available as good practice. For the higher hazard classes of 4.1.2 and class 5.2, I've got in there, the cabinets under these standards are brought into the regulations as a means of meeting the construction requirements for a secure container or storage area for our self-reactive and our organic peroxide substances. So they are, again, brought in by the regulations there. So there's no reference in the regulations to cabinets for oxidizing liquids and solids, or for your other class 4 substances, the readily combustibles, the dangerous when wets, and the desensitized explosives. A few organisations have been granted exemptions through the exemption process to use cabinets for the storage of class 4 substances, and it's always been my hope that a safe work instrument would be developed that would permit that for small quantities. With those class 4 substances, they have very low thresholds for location compliance certification. They're as low as 1 kilogram. And so having a big 4-hour fire rated store when you've got 3 kilograms of a substance can be a bit disproportionate, but the regulations as they currently stand don't permit a cabinet, but some places have gone through exemptions to get those. So even if the regulations don't require or make provision for cabinets, in all cases, even for smaller quantities, you should be considering cabinets as one of your options if you don't have a dedicated store for your hazardous substances. And perhaps I could say in particular that your dangerous goods, the substances that are of the higher hazard. Got one more question that had come in relation to this, and a simple request: is there any simple guidance that companies can apply referring to flammable safety cabinets, especially when they're holding smaller quantities in the hazardous areas? And my answer to this is perhaps a double-edged sword. Simple guidance is available, but the simple guidance invokes the hazardous area of 3 metres laterally from our cabinet and 1 metre above any opening. So those can be quite large areas when you're dealing with small cabinets and small places, particularly laboratories. The standard AS 1940, which is the one that specifies what the cabinet needs to meet, specifies this distance or a distance that's been determined in accordance with ASNZS 60079.10.1, our classification of hazardous areas. So we can then start looking at what classification we will determine under that standard. And there's 2 ways we can look at that. So the standard provides a method for determining and classifying hazardous areas based on first principles, and it also provides a number of example or typical classifications that can be used. And again, that's where we get that 3 metres and 1 metre zone for our cabinets. For smaller quantities, those are not necessarily representative of what the risk would be. And there is a newer version of the classification standard that was issued in 2022, and it does differ when it deals with flammable liquids cabinets from the previous 2009 version. That 2009 version is the one that's still referenced by the regulations. And while the new standard, the 2022 version, it does provide more parameters for looking at flammable cabinets. But again, it's not a straightforward one size fits all. It gets a wee bit detailed in the purpose of that hazardous area and the size that you're dealing with. Other factors can come into play when you're looking at your hazardous area for cabinets, in particular if you are using extraction ventilation on the cabinet. We've got then you get a negative pressure situation where your airflow is from the room into the cabinet and out to a safe area. So in that case, the hazardous area is reduced within the cabinet. So simple guidance exists, but it gives a very conservative answer. You can do more complicated or more fit for a specific purpose work, but it's again not necessarily an off-the-shelf solution. Time keeps on ticking away, and it certainly is in this webinar. So your location certification comes around each year, or 3 yearly in some cases. But it's not the only hazardous substance matter that needs to be renewed, and there's a lot of changes that may have happened on site that mean you need to take action. So I'd like to draw your attention to 2 wee sections here. The matters that could be expiring that relate to your certification. Whole lot of different periods in here. So your periodic verification for your electrical installations in hazardous areas, that needs to be done at least every 4 years. If you have any work done in between times, then you'll have other documentation with that. If you have an exemption under the Health and Safety at Work Act, those are only valid for 5 years, and you need to be aware that after the 5 years, it's not a renewal process. It is applying for a new exemption, and there may be an expectation, depending on the reason for your exemption, that you have made further steps towards becoming compliant when that new application needs to come through. Safety data sheets need to be renewed every 5 years. And just a reminder that it is your New Zealand supplier's duty to provide you with a compliant safety data sheet. If you're looking at your data sheet in front of you, a quick check is to make sure that it's got New Zealand contact details, the company details, as well as perhaps the poison centre or the correct emergency numbers, that it's got the has no approval number, the HSR number, and so that might refer to a group standard or to an individual substance, and it should be less than 5 years old. And it's very unlikely that you're going to have all your safety data sheets on the same cycle, so you will have safety data sheets coming due every 3 months on an ongoing basis. So make sure you've got an appropriate system in place that you can check those. You might need integrity testing for any of the tanks or bunds, or for verification of deluge or sprinkler systems. That information or the requirements for those will be very specific to the nature of the infrastructure that those relate to. If you have certified handlers, they become due, they expire after 5 years. And again, that's not a renewal process as such, it's going through and getting a new certificate. And your ERP testing, I did a webinar on that last year about making the most of your ERP test, making sure that your emergency response plan is fit for purpose and that you've considered your relevant scenarios in emergencies and response at least annually. So those are your expiring things. You may also have changes on site that mean you have to update a range of things. So whether it's changes to personnel, you've changed a process or a system, you've got new or no longer used products anymore, you might have changed buildings or layout on site, something's been demolished, moved equipment, made improvements. If you've got something that's better on site, you should also take into account seasonal variation in what you do and what that means for how you might do your response or what substances on site, and also what your work patterns and conditions are. So if you start adding in more outdoors work or night work, that might change some of the procedures that you need to do. And so these might impact on your training records or your training processes, the contact details that you need to have in your documents. Your site plans, again, need to be updated. So if we come to site to look at your site, and we're looking at the map and we're looking at the site and saying, well, what's that building there? Why isn't it on the plan? Or vice versa. We need to make sure that our site plans are accurate. Your emergency response procedures should be updated, and the purpose of testing them annually is to make sure that we can capture some of these changes to update our procedures. And we need to make sure that our inventory and safety data sheets are all up to date. And with a note on inventory, the inventory that we need to see for compliance is about showing what's on site, what's the maximum that's likely to be there. And so that is different from perhaps your stock on hand holdings that will tell you exactly what's there now. And if you do have seasonal variation in some of your significant substances, then it can be quite useful to note that onto the inventory. Where there is quite a cyclic process, you might find that the total that your inventory says exceeds what your certified quantity is. And that's not a problem as long as we know that it's clear that they're not all present at the same time, but at every given point in the year, there could be up to that amount present. All right, time for the frustrating part. It can be really frustrating for both you and the certifier if we've come to do your inspection and things that were okay in the past are no longer acceptable. And this might be because of a reinterpretation of the regulations. It might be updated guidance from WorkSafe, cabinets and site plans as the example, and a need for more robust evidence of things. Or indeed, we make mistakes that might have been missed in the past. There are 3 areas I wanted to talk about here, and it's fire extinguishers, signage, and fire ratings. The purpose of fire extinguishers is to provide our first line of defence in extinguishing small fires. If your 5,000 litre flammable liquid store is on fire, you're not going to use fire extinguishers to bring that under control. It's simply not the case. Many sites do not expect, and very reasonably so, people to fight fires with their hazardous substances with an extinguisher. An extinguisher that is available can put out a small fire quickly before it gets a chance to grow, if it's safe to do so, and it might be needed to help you evacuate an area as well. There is a requirement in the hazardous substance regulations to have these. They need to be clearly visible, readily accessible, they need to have the correct rating, and they need to be within their test date. One of the things that we've been looking more closely at is around that clearly visible and readily accessible part. And so I take the first view, I'm standing at the location, can I see an extinguisher? If I can't, then we need to do something about that. We also need to consider, is it accessible from there? And we've looked at what happens if the extinguishers that we need are actually inside the store. Are they locked inside the LPG cage? Are they inside the flammable liquid store? They may be accessible to someone who's actively working with those substances, but we've just discussed that the main scenario for the extinguishers is perhaps for an incidental fire. So in the event that there's a fire that is small and is safe to attack with an extinguisher, you don't want to be going and opening up your hazardous substances location to get to the extinguisher. So it's when we look at the accessibility, we want to make sure that there's something that's accessible when people are outside the store. It's not always practical to have an extinguisher outside near the location. There are valid security concerns around theft for those. And to help manage that, a notice at the location advising of the location of the nearest extinguisher that's accessible during operating times may be acceptable. We're seeing more and more of that, particularly if you're looking at LPG in hospitality situations where an extinguisher out the back, where there's no supervision, where people can wander and unobserved, they're going to go missing. Signage. Again, another one that we're being a bit more robust on looking at. There's requirements around what information is on the sign, that it is clearly visible and legible. The requirement is that it is legible from 10 metres away. When we look at the content, we want to make sure that the pictograms are applicable to the substances present. They should be accurate. This is not a case for the more the merrier. We want to make sure that the pictograms on our signage are relevant to the substances at the location that they're providing warning about. We need to make sure that the warning provided by the sign is clearly visible to people coming from all approaches, including not obscuring critical information. And there's not much information on a sign, it's all pretty critical, isn't obscured behind perhaps the bars on a shipping container if that's being used as a store, on the back of doors that are kept open more often than not, and that they're clean and not faded. WorkSafe have published some guidance. This one's called a quick guide to hazardous substance signage, and it's missing one key piece of information that we get lots of questions about, is how big does it need to be? So there is guidance, and the size is something that we're looking closely at. So we need to be legible from not less than 10 metres under varying conditions. So for example, in poor weather or poor lighting. Most of the time when we come to site, it's daytime and generally not pouring with rain, but sometimes it is. So if we need to do the test on site, as we go and step 10 metres back and see if we can read the sign. Now, we do have a huge advantage in that we look at hazardous substances signs all the time, so we tend to know what they say, so someone who isn't familiar with them might not be able to get that comprehension as quickly. But if we go 10 metres away, we can read signs most of the time, depending on the size. There's no prescribed size for the signs. The gas Gas New Zealand, formerly the LPG Association, published some guidance in consultation with WorkSafe a few years ago that draws on the information in the Australian Standard for Safety Signs in the Occupational Environment. And their conclusion from that was that letters that are 30 millimetres in height is acceptable for the legibility requirements if the sign is clearly visible. So if it's not obscured, it's not in permanent shade. If it's not clearly visible, then the letter size will need to be at least 50 millimetres. The former has no approved code of practice around signage, specified 35 millimetre lettering and 100 mils for the HAZCAM wording at the top of our sign, and pictograms with 100 mil signage. So there is guidance out there in perhaps non-intuitive locations. This lettering size is quite big. So I've got some examples to show you of what size lettering looks like at different size signs. So the HAZCAM in these examples is all 50 millimetres, the no ignition 40 millimetres, and the Call 111 and 30 millimetres. And this is how much information of that size you can fit on an A4 sheet of paper. So there's no way that we're going to get all the information that we need at a size that's going to be clearly legible onto an A4 size. And they do exist. I've seen several signs that are only that size. Moving up to A3, lettering size still the same. We can fit more information on. And in some cases, A3 size signs are legible from that distance, but it's a bit of a struggle. And we moved up to A2, then we're getting more and more information available that we can read clearly. So do make sure that you take those steps. If you're looking at your signage, step back that 10 metres, grab some colleagues who aren't familiar with it, and see if you can actually read the information that's on there. Okay. And then the last topic in the "it was okay last time" section is talking about fire rating evidence. So there are several areas where fire resistance rated construction is needed. So LPG located up against buildings, for flammable liquid stores and workrooms. Fire rated construction is an option in place for the separation of incompatibles and ignition sources for class 4 and 5 substances, as well as the delineation of our control zone. And we can reduce our separation distance for protected and public places for toxics and corrosives with a fire rated wall. It's not as simple as just looking at what the construction material is. So in this beautiful software system I can use for drafting up a flammable liquid store, I don't know what the fire rating of smooth stone versus cobbled deep slate might be. We need to get the information for the system in place. So each fire resisting rating system out there has specific installation criteria that must be met if the rating is to be achieved. So if someone comes to me and says, yes, it's got 19 mil fire line jib, therefore it should have XYZ fire rating, that's not sufficient information. I need information from the person, the builder who did the work, that it has been installed in accordance with JIB's manual for achieving that fire rated system. It's not guaranteed to meet that if you don't follow their requirements for spacing of screws and the use of stopping compounds and all that. And the same applies for hardy board and Hebel blocks and all those range of fire rated systems. They have their specifications that must be met. Ideally, there will be a producer statement for the work, and there will definitely be one if it was subject to building consent. So we're talking there usually about a PS3, a construction producer statement. What I need to see on that producer statement is that it was installed in accordance with the plans that the consent was built on, and in accordance with the manufacturer's specification and what fire rating it has been built to achieve. So I do see producer statements that say it was built to the plan and the specification, but it doesn't state what the fire rating was. For existing concrete walls, It's not as simple as just measuring the wall and looking up a table and seeing what the fire rating is. The fire rating of concrete walls will depend on the reinforcing, including how spaced and how deep it is within the wall, the infill for concrete blocks, the aggregate used in the concrete, as well as the joints, connections, and sealants used in constructing the store, the building, the wall there. It's not the certifier's role to determine the fire rating of your structures. The PCBU is required to provide that evidence, and so then you would be going through to the PCBU, the contractor who does this, to get that evidence. If it's a system that's been in place for a number of years, there may be information in the council documentation, or you may need to get a report from a fire engineer for this. I do note, however, that for class 4 and 5, and for specific regulations only, and also for intervening walls for LPG, it is acceptable to take the thickness of a reinforced concrete wall as a means of determining that the firewall is compliant. Again, need to make sure that we know that it's a reinforced concrete wall and those there. For fire doors, it's generally more straightforward. Then fire doors need to have tags on every element of the door. So that would be each leaf and also the frame of the door. And if those tags are not present, we will ask you to go back to the supplier about those. A fire door is a set, and the tags don't come when the door is supplied, because again, it's how it's installed that provides that fire rating. So they're only added after the installation is complete, which is why they sometimes get missed off. And so they're not interchangeable either. So if a door is damaged, you just can't swap it out with a fire door from another door. You need to make sure that door set is reconfirmed as having the fire rating. And one last thing I wanted to talk about really is the GHS. It's been a good couple of years now since the EPA adopted the GHS classification system. This is one of our correlation tables between HAZNO and GHS. It's on our website. And everything seems to be so far so good. You don't really notice it in the hazardous substance regulation regime. You'll notice it probably more with your safety data sheets. There's one more year left in that transition period for labels, safety data sheet, and packaging to comply with the updated EPA notices. But the hazardous substance regulations, they continue to refer to the HAZNO classifications. Any new regulations can continue to use those HAZNO regulations until 5 years after we adopted GHS, so that's till April 2026. And after that, any changes to the regulations will have to use the new classification system. I'm not aware of any active plans for the review of the regulations by MB, and that's despite what the intent was when the regulations were transferred over, and despite the briefing to the incoming minister, which acknowledged that I'll quote here, the regulations for hazardous substances that manage a significant range of acute health and catastrophic risk are large and complex, making them difficult to understand and apply, especially for small businesses. And I think we can all appreciate that complexity. As with all our other webinars, they're available on our YouTube channel. You can catch up with those. And if there are any questions, I will have a look in the chat shortly just to see if anything has come through. Otherwise, questions afterwards, feel free to email those through to info@ChemSafety. We're happy to help. I hope this has been useful to you, and we'll see you all again next time.